We are in Mark chapter 10. Mark chapter 10. And we noticed last week at the end of class, Mark's account of Jesus' third prediction of his passion. And you remember what we've said, you have to remember what we've said because I've said it so many times, that these three predictions of Jesus' passion, they occur in this part of Mark's gospel in between two stories of Jesus healing blind men. And after each prediction of Jesus' passion, we've got an account of the disciples misunderstanding what Jesus is saying. And we just prayed that God would help us not to allow our preconceptions to cloud our spiritual eyes from understanding what His Word says. Well, that's exactly what the disciples did. Because the disciples were just so locked into a Messiah who would act as a military general to overthrow the Roman forces. They did not understand this concept of a Messiah who would die on a Roman cross. It just totally boggled their mind. And so, these stories being in between, these failures on the part of the disciples in between these two healing stories illustrate the fact that the disciples they understand Jesus is Messiah, but they don't see. So they see more than the Jewish rulers do, who don't admit that Jesus is the Messiah, but they sure don't see as much as they should see. And so we're on the second page of your handout, and this is the same handout that we had last week. So we start off then with this passage, verses 35, and the passage goes to verse 45. We're just going to read through verse 40 now, and then we'll pick up our comments. So, actually, let's drop back and let's just read beginning in verse 32, and we'll go through verse 40. We'll go ahead and read the prediction of Jesus' passion, just because that sets the stage for what follows. So, Mark 10, beginning in verse 32. They were on their way up to Jerusalem, with Jesus leading the way, and the disciples were astonished, while those who followed were afraid. Again, he took the 12 aside and told them what was going to happen to him. "We're going up to Jerusalem," he said, "and the Son of Man will be delivered over to the chief priests and the teachers of the law. They will condemn him to death and will hand him over to the Gentiles, who will mock him and spit on him, flog him, and kill him. 3 days later he will rise." Then James and John, the sons of Zebedee, came to him. "Teacher," they said, "we want you to do for us whatever we ask." "What do you want me to do for you?" he asked. They replied, "Let one of us sit at your right and the other at your left in your glory." "You don't know what you're asking," Jesus said. "Can you drink the cup I drink? Or be baptized with the baptism I'm baptized with?" "We can," they answered. Jesus said to them, "You will drink the cup I drink, and be baptized with the baptism I'm baptized with. But to sit at my right or left is not for me to grant. These places belong to those for whom they have been prepared." So, you remember how back in chapter 8, we'll just turn back and look at chapter 8. Look at verses 14 and 15. Mark 8, verses 14 and 15. The disciples had forgotten to bring bread. Now, Jesus had just multiplied the loaves and fish and fed the 4,000, but they forgot to take bread, except for one loaf they had with them in the boat. "Be careful," Jesus warned them. "Watch out for the yeast of the Pharisees and that of Herod." Now, as we go through there, Jesus wasn't talking about literal bread. He's talking about the influence of the Pharisees and the influence of Herod. And, what was the besetting sin of the Pharisees and the besetting sin of Herod? Well, it was a desire for greatness. And so the disciples have to be careful that they're not misled by the yeast of the Pharisees and the yeast of Herod, so that they themselves are seeking greatness, earthly worldly glory for themselves. Well, even though Jesus warned the disciples about that, that's exactly what they're doing. And look here at B under our section here on the second page of the handout. The closest disciples to Jesus were Peter, James, and John. And you see that from, any number of places. I mean, I've got a few references here from Mark's gospel account. Right? We know that these are special disciples because, in chapter 1, verses 16 to 20, we have an explicit account of how Jesus called Peter, Andrew, James, and John to follow him. Now, you look at Mark's account, you've got him calling Matthew, but those are the only 5 disciples that you have an explicit account of how they became Jesus' followers, so they're special. And then, chapter 3, verses 16 to 18, you've got the list of the apostles. Jesus choosing the 12 apostles. And when you look at the places where those lists are found, that is Matthew 10, here in Mark 3, Luke chapter 6, and Acts chapter 1, every time that list is given, do you know what names lead the list? Peter, Andrew, James, and John. So these are special apostles. And then there were occasions where Jesus just took with him those disciples. Chapter 5, I've got the reference there, verse 37. He took Peter, James, and John with him into Jairus' house to raise his daughter from the dead. Mount of Transfiguration, chapter 9 and verse 2, he takes up with him onto the mountain Peter, James, and John. Chapter 13, verse 3, the Olivet Discourse, where Jesus talks about the destruction of Jerusalem and his second coming. Well, to whom was the Olivet Discourse given? Well, chapter 13, verse 3, it's Peter, Andrew, James, and John. These are special apostles. So, the first time that Jesus foretold his passion, we're told, you remember back in chapter 8, that Peter misunderstood it. Peter took Jesus and began to rebuke Jesus and said, "Far be it from you, Lord, this won't happen to you." And Jesus turned and said to Peter, "Hey, get behind me, Satan." But now the other 2 of Jesus' closest disciples, James and John, right after Jesus foretells his passion, they misunderstand and they ask for positions of worldly glory. And so, this is told to illustrate the fact that this attitude is pervasive among the disciples. Now, there's an interesting detail that Matthew's account gives us that we don't find in Mark. Now, by the way, this particular incident is only told to us by 2 of the synoptic gospel writers. It's not included in Luke's account for whatever reason. But Matthew gives us another detail. And look at Matthew's detail. Turn back to Matthew chapter 20. Matthew 20, and let's look at verses 20 and 21. There we're told, "Then the mother of Zebedee's sons came to Jesus with her sons, and kneeling down asked a favor of him. 'What do you want?' he asked. She said, 'Grant that one of these 2 sons of mine may sit at your right and the other at your left in your kingdom.'" Now you remember, Mark's account tells us that it's James and John, but Matthew's account tells us that it was their mother, because their father was Zebedee, and so their mother comes and makes the request. And the way that the gospel accounts work, they're not contradicting one another. They're complementary. They're not contradictory. And one thing is clear, when you look at the different accounts of the gospel, agency is recognized. You can do something through someone else. Right? So probably the way that this worked was that James and John put their mother up to it. And the mother was the one that actually made the request, but it was James and John through the mother. So there's no conflict. It's just, Mark is focusing on the actual source of the request, whereas Matthew tells us, who actually verbalized the particular request. But why would they have their mother come and make this request? Well, that's an interesting point, and we explore it just a little bit. Right? So the mother of Zebedee's sons, the wife of Zebedee, She was herself a disciple of Jesus. She was present at Jesus' crucifixion. Look at Matthew's account of Jesus' crucifixion. Matthew chapter 27. Look at verse 56. Matthew 27, verse 56. Well, we'll read 55 and 56. Many women were there, that is at the cross, watching from a distance. They had followed Jesus from Galilee to care for his needs. So whenever you read, for instance, back in Mark chapter 10 and verse 32, about them going to Jerusalem, the disciples were astonished and those who followed were afraid. Keep in mind that in that group are these women who ultimately will be standing at the foot of Jesus' cross. So who are the women? Verse 56 of Matthew 27. Among them were Mary Magdalene, remember, out of whom Jesus had cast the 7 demons, and Mary, the mother of James and Joseph, and the mother of Zebedee's sons. So here we have reference to 3 women who were there at the cross. Okay, so what was her name? We're told here that she's the mother of Zebedee's children. What was her name? Well, we may, and I emphasize may, have her name found in Mark's account of this. Look at Mark chapter 15. Mark chapter 15. And look at verse 40. Now remember, Matthew's account tells us that there were 3 women, Mary Magdalene, Mary the mother of James and Joseph, and then the 3rd woman, the mother of Zebedee's sons. So Mark's account, Mark 15 verse 20 says, some women were watching from a distance. Among them were Mary Magdalene, Mary the mother of James the younger and of Joseph, and Salome. And so, there's a good chance that Salome was the name of the mother of Zebedee's sons, that Salome was the wife of Zebedee, that married couple was Zebedee and Salome. But again, why would James and John put Salome, their mother, up to asking Jesus? Well, we may find the clue in John's gospel account. Look at John chapter 19. And again, I emphasize may. But this is a view that's been held pretty commonly. So John's account of the women who were standing near the cross, John 19 verse 25 says this, near the cross of Jesus stood his mother. Now that's a detail we don't have in the synoptic accounts. Mary, Jesus' own mother, was a witness of Jesus' crucifixion. His mother's sister. So Mary was there and Jesus' aunt was there, his mother's sister. And then Mary, the wife of Cleopas. Now you think that might be Mary, the mother of James and Joseph, that we read about in the synoptic gospel accounts? It probably was. Probably Cleopas was the father of James and Joseph, and Mary was the mother, and then Mary Magdalene. So in Matthew's account and Mark's account, we're told 3 women were there. In John's account, we're told that 4 women were there. And the different woman, the 4th woman who's different, for certain, was Jesus' own mother. But then it's very possible that Salome, the mother of Zebedee's children, was also Mary's sister, Jesus' aunt. And so isn't that an interesting possibility? That James and John knew Jesus for some time because they were related. They were cousins. And James and John put their mother up to asking Jesus for this glory in the kingdom because their mother's Jesus' aunt. And Jesus is more likely to say yes to his aunt than what he is to say yes to them. Now again, that's not an airtight case. There's a chance that there were more women there than just 4 by putting those accounts together. But that's been a view that's been commonly held among Bible readers. All right, so what is it then that James and John are thinking when they put their mother up to asking Jesus, grant us to sit in your glory, one at your right and one at your left? What exactly are they up to? Well, we suggested last week a part of the reason why they make this request. You remember some words that they heard just shortly before this? Go back to Matthew 19. Remember at the end of Matthew's account of the incident with the rich young ruler, in response to Peter's question, we've left everything and followed you, what will we have? Jesus says to his apostles, Matthew 19 verse 28, truly I tell you, at the renewal of all things, or, as we said last week, in the regeneration, when the Son of Man sits on his glorious throne, you who have followed me will also sit on 12 thrones, judging the 12 tribes of Israel. So Jesus has promised them that they're going to sit on thrones. So, they've not pulled this out of thin air, and they're not being, super presumptive, because he's already promised them they're going to sit on thrones. But notice where they want to sit. They don't want to just sit on thrones. They want to sit on the thrones closest to Jesus. So they ask, again, verse 37, and by the way, the tactic, not just the tactic of getting possibly Jesus' aunt to make the request, but don't you love the way that they start off, back to Mark 10, look at verse 35. Then James and John, the sons of Zebedee, came to him. Teacher, they ask, we want you to do for us whatever we ask. Don't you love it when your kids come up to you and ask you to do something for them? Would you do a favor for me before they tell you what the favor is? You never commit to anything until you hear the details. Never sign a blank check. And Jesus wasn't about to sign a blank check. But they ask, verse 37, let us sit one at your right and one at your left in your glory. Now, those are the positions of greatest honor, because notice where Jesus sits. Look at Psalm 110. Psalm 110 is the most oft quoted psalm in the New Testament. And it's a messianic psalm. It foretells of Jesus' reign as king. And so, a big deal is made of the fact that David writes this, but David is not speaking about himself. Psalm 110 verse 1 says, the Lord says to my Lord. Now the first Lord there is Yahweh. The words look nearly the same in our English Bibles because it's L-O-R-D, but our translators do distinguish them somewhat, because L-O-R-D in the first instance is in small caps. And so anytime your translation has, in the Old Testament, L-O-R-D in small caps, it indicates the fact that what's being translated is what's called the Tetragrammaton. It's the sacred name of God. 4 letters, that's why Tetragrammaton, but the sacred name of God, Yahweh. So Yahweh says to, David says, my Lord. And, later when we get in Mark, we're going to see in chapter 12 that, David is going to, or Jesus is going to quote this text and is going to say, well, whose son is Messiah? And they say, well, Messiah is David's son. And he'll say, well, if Messiah is David's son, how then did David say of Messiah, he's my Lord? And so, that's going to, and of course, the solution to all of that is the virgin birth. It's the fact that even though Jesus was the son of David, yes, Jesus also preceded David. Because Jesus is the second person of the Trinity, and by means of the virgin birth, he became man in the womb of a descendant of David. But at any rate, the Lord says to my Lord, all that is extraneous to the point that I'm trying to make here. Sit at my right hand until I make your enemies a footstool for your feet. So Jesus right now in heaven is reigning on David's throne, and where is that? It's at God the Father's right hand. So sitting at one's right hand, that is the place of greatest honor. Now notice, remember, Jesus did not consider equality with God something to be used for his own advantage. Jesus is fully God as the Father is fully God. But Jesus has assumed a position of lesser authority than the Father. And he will have that position of lesser authority than the Father throughout all eternity. 1 Corinthians 15, verse 28 makes that clear. And so God the Father is all in all, and Jesus Christ sits at the Father's right hand. And so that's not a throne as high as the Father's, if you will, but that's the next highest throne. And so James and John say, well, let us sit one at your right and one at your left in your glory. Now that's an interesting way to describe it. Let us sit in your glory, because Matthew's account says, let us sit one at your right and one at your left in your kingdom. Look at Matthew's account again. Matthew chapter 20. And look at verse 21. So middle of the verse, James and John's mother say, grant that one of these two sons of mine may sit at your right and the other at your left in your kingdom. So kingdom in Matthew 20:21 is glory in Mark chapter 10 and verse 37. The two are synonymous. And you remember the promise that Jesus made in Matthew 19:28. In the regeneration, when the Son of Man sits on the throne of his glory. So throne indicates kingdom, and it's a glorious throne. So the two are the same. What exactly do James and John have in mind? What do they envision is going to happen when they get to Jerusalem? You wonder, remember, they were present on the Mount of Transfiguration. They've seen the divine glory that's lurking just under Jesus' skin. They saw Jesus transfigured with his face shining brighter than the noonday sun. Are they expecting Jesus, whenever he gets to Jerusalem, to manifest that glory again? And with that open manifestation of his glory in Jerusalem, are they expecting his kingdom to begin? And just for the Romans to fall down in the presence of such great glory, the way that they were overwhelmed? Is that their expectation? That may be their expectation. I don't know, but they're wrong. But did you want to say something?
Well, it's happened in the past.
Exactly. Yeah. So
in their history, God has wiped out everybody that he didn't want.
Very true. That's right. And remember on the Mount of Transfiguration, whenever Jesus said, "Don't tell this to anyone until after the Son of Man has risen from the dead," they were questioning, what on earth is he talking about? Son of Man risen from the dead? And their primary problem with that is they don't expect the Son of Man to die. That's their thing. So anyway. Well, Jesus points out their ignorance. Because Jesus says, verse 38, you don't know what you're asking. And by the way, how many times do you think God has said that in response to our prayers? We just haven't heard him say it. You remember Garth Brooks' song, Unanswered Prayers? Sometimes I thank God for unanswered prayers. I guess there's a sense in which Garth Brooks' theology is a little off, because I don't think there are unanswered prayers. The answer's sometimes no. The answer's sometimes later. And of course, sometimes the answer is yes. So I don't think they're unanswered prayers. But he is right that we ought to thank God that God didn't grant us everything that we asked, because, much of the time we don't know what we're asking. And, that's not a problem that ends, once we graduate high school. We are notoriously bad at knowing what's best for ourselves. But God always gives us what's best, big picture best. And so Jesus says, you don't know what you're asking. And then Jesus tries to correct their misconception concerning the nature of the kingdom. Because for them, Jesus' kingdom starts with the manifestation of his glory. But you know what the repeated theme is? We just see this over and over. Messiah suffers first and then enters into his glory. Suffering first, then glory. And so Jesus asks them a question. He often replies to questions with questions. Verse 38, can you drink the cup I drink, or be baptized with the baptism that I'm baptized with? And, obviously, what Jesus is talking about when he talks about the cup that he's about to drink, the baptism that he's about to be baptized with, he's speaking in figurative terms. There is a cup that Jesus is going to drink in the future, a literal cup. He's going to drink, the cup of the fruit of the vine with the disciples at the Last Supper. But he's not talking about literally drinking that cup. He is talking about what that cup represents. And of course, there is no literal baptism that Jesus is going to undergo in the future. He did undergo a literal baptism in the past. Mark's gospel starts with a baptism that Jesus underwent in the past, a literal baptism, his baptism by John. But Mark's gospel ends with Jesus being baptized, not with a literal baptism, but we'll see the baptism that it ends with is his baptism in suffering. But notice what cup Jesus is talking about. Look at Mark chapter 14. After Jesus and the disciples drank the cup at the Last Supper, they leave the upper room there in Jerusalem, and they go, east across the Kidron Valley, and they go up on the Mount of Olives into the Garden of Gethsemane. And Jesus prays. And, Mark's account says this. Look at verses 35 and 36. Going a little farther, he fell to the ground and prayed that if possible the hour might pass from him. Abba, Father. Abba, of course, is the Aramaic word for father. And then, as Mark is apt to do, he translates that for us. His audience was not Aramaic speaking, and so he translates it as Father. Abba, Father, he said, everything is possible for you. Take this cup from me, yet not what I will, but what you will. And of course, the cup that's being referred to there is his suffering on the cross. And there's an Old Testament background to that. Over and over in the Old Testament, God's pouring out his wrath on a sinful nation is described as them giving a cup of unmixed wine to drink. And you see that over and over again. Jeremiah 25 is a great place where you see that, where Jeremiah is to make the nations drink the cup of God's wrath. And Jeremiah issued these prophecies of God's judgment to the nations. That's how he would make the nations drink the cup of God's wrath. But, just like if someone were to drink a cup of unmixed wine, strong, Jews would mix the wine to reduce its strength. You'd put 2 or 3 parts water with 1 part wine, but if you drink the unmixed wine, you get drunk. And when you get drunk, you stagger around. And when you get drunk and stagger around, you get hurt, And so that's the description of God's judgment. And so literally, the wine of God's wrath that all of our sins merited, that all of us would have to drink in hell by suffering an eternity in hell, Jesus Christ drank from the hand of the Father on the cross. Now granted, he only spent 6 hours of agony on the cross, but what we as finite beings could experience in an infinite amount of time, Jesus, being an infinite being, was able to experience in a finite amount of time. So he was able to experience the cumulative suffering of sin on the cross for us. He drank the cup of God's wrath.
Oh, just a little, not to take away, but sometimes when you forget about everything else besides the cross, like the lashes is what I'm going to say. The lashes, and then the crown of thorns. So when you I said, I could understand his apprehension when he was praying to his Father to take it away, because that's a lot. I mean, just thinking about would scare a person to, just what I'm about to go through. All the things, the people hitting on him and all that's a lot.
Absolutely. But again, I don't think the main aspect of the cross is the physical pain. I mean, that was just, unfathomable to go through all of that. But that wasn't the main thing that Jesus, is begging to not experience. Because Jesus understands that, on the cross, there's a divine aspect to it that everybody on earth is totally blind to. Everyone who's hung on a tree, according to Deuteronomy, is cursed. So he is under God's curse. And, he's forsaken by the Father, on the cross. And so it's that divine aspect that was even more horrendous than the physical suffering that Jesus endured on the cross. But that's the cup that Jesus says, he's going to drink of, and the disciples are going to drink a form of that cup. And then, there's this baptism that Jesus is going to endure. Look at Luke 12:50. Now, we don't have as clear of a text identifying what this baptism is as what we have identifying what the cup is. But it's still pretty clear. So Luke 12, look at verses 49 and 50. Jesus says, I've come to bring fire on the earth, and how I wish it were already kindled. Now, is that not a shocking statement? He's the Prince of Peace. But he's come to bring fire on the earth. A consequence of Jesus' ministry is wrath. You remember what Jesus said in John 15? If I hadn't come and done the works among them that no other man did, they would not have had sin. It's a horrible thing for people to rebel against God's revelation in creation and His revelation in conscience, and to sin in that way. God has revealed Himself clearly enough to every person on earth that nobody has an excuse. Everybody is without excuse. But a far worse sin is to reject the Son of God. And so a consequence of Jesus' ministry is fire. And he says, verse 50, but I have a baptism to undergo, and what constraint I'm under until it's completed. And so, it seems pretty clear that the baptism that he's talking about is a reference to, his suffering, his being immersed in suffering on the cross, his being immersed in God's wrath, if you will, on the cross. But definitely the idea of suffering. All right, so Jesus, asked the disciples, again, back to Mark chapter 10, can you drink the cup that I drink or be baptized with the baptism that I'm baptized with? And they're so foolish. They said, we can do that. Not a problem. Again, they don't know what they're saying. And Jesus replies, he says, verse 39, you will drink the cup that I drink and be baptized with the baptism that I'm baptized with. And of course they did that, didn't they? They suffered. Jesus suffered at the hands of the Jews, at the hands of the Romans, at the hands of the unbelievers, and of course the disciples did as well. James was the first martyr. Look at Acts 12. Acts 12, look at verses 1 and 2. It was about this time that King Herod arrested some who belonged to the church. Now, this King Herod obviously isn't Herod the Great. And this King Herod was not the Herod, before whom Jesus appeared, in his second Gentile trial before his crucifixion. It's not Herod Antipas. This King Herod is Herod Agrippa I. And he was the son of Archelaus, who had ruled over Judea after the death of Herod the Great. So this is the grandson of Herod the Great, Herod Agrippa I. And at the end of Acts, you're going to read about Paul and his case being heard by Herod Agrippa II. This Herod Agrippa's son, okay? So it was about this time that King Herod arrested some, and by the way, while as, Herod Antipas was, just a tetrarch, which is a lesser title, ruler of a fourth, this particular Herod, Herod Agrippa, was granted the title that his grandfather had had. He's king. He's been granted the title as king by the Romans. So it was about this time that King Herod arrested some who belonged to the church, intending to persecute them. He had James, the brother of John, put to death with the sword. And when he saw that it met the approval of the Jews, he proceeded to seize Peter also. So here he's the first martyr. So, sure enough, he drank the cup that Jesus drank, and he was baptized with the baptism that Jesus was baptized with. And, John, look at Revelation 1. John, well, let me just say this. It's reported that all of the apostles except for John was martyred. Now, in reality, when you get to looking at the evidence for all of that, it's not all that clear. There's a lot of legend that has built up. We can say for certain, I'm very confident that Peter and Paul were both martyred in Rome at about the same time during Nero's persecutions. And we've got some pretty good historical evidence for that. For instance, the first non-apostolic Christian writing that was written is a little document called First Clement. And, Clement is now, the Catholics view Clement as a pope in Rome, a successor to Peter. Not evidence for that. And it's not altogether certain that Clement wrote the letter. The letter was just written from the church at Rome to the church at Corinth, but it's attributed to Clement. But anyway, in 1 Clement, it's written about 95 AD. So it was written about the time that John wrote the book of Revelation. So this is really early. And in 1 Clement, he makes reference to the martyrdom of both Peter and Paul. So there's really good evidence to say that Peter and Paul were martyred about the same time in Rome during Nero's persecutions. You always hear the story that, Peter was crucified head down, because he didn't feel worthy to be executed in the way that Jesus was. Well, the evidence for that is just, that's not a reliable story. It makes for good legend, but it's not reliable. So you don't have a lot of real reliable evidence for how all of the apostles died. John, it is pretty clear that John was not martyred. And John probably was the last living apostle. Tradition says, and it's on pretty good authority, that John lived into the reign of Trajan, the Emperor Trajan. After Jerusalem was destroyed, he traveled from Jerusalem to Ephesus and lived out his life in Ephesus. So from AD 70 on, and tradition says that he lived into the reign of Trajan, Emperor Trajan. And Trajan ruled from AD 98 to AD 117. So, wouldn't assume by that he lived to the end of Trajan's reign, but he lived into Trajan's reign. So John probably lived to about 100, But even though John wasn't martyred, John did suffer. And so Revelation was written during the reign of Emperor Domitian. And Domitian, Nero persecuted the church, but he just primarily persecuted the church in Rome. There wasn't a lot of persecution that spread outside of Rome. Domitian's persecution was possibly a little bit more widespread than that, because of Domitian claiming to be God and demanding worship as a way to try to unify the empire. And so, as a result of that, especially was it heavy, it seems like, in Asia Minor. Even though Domitian's in Rome, the emperor cult was really strong in Asia Minor. And that's where John was. John was in Ephesus. So, in the book of Revelation, John says, look at Revelation 1, verse 9. I, John, your brother. Now, isn't that a humble way for an apostle to begin identifying himself? I, John, your brother, and companion in the suffering and kingdom and patient endurance that are ours in Jesus, was on the island of Patmos because of the word of God and the testimony of Jesus. Now, Patmos was kind of I guess we could say like a prison colony of sorts. So he's exiled from Ephesus, off the coast of Asia Minor, off the coast of Turkey, to this island of Patmos, for a period of time, while after Domitian's death, he went back to Ephesus, but for persecution. So John, even though he wasn't executed, he did drink of the cup that Jesus drank from, and he was baptized with the baptism Jesus was baptized with. He certainly suffered. Okay, the bell's probably about to ring. Any comments on what we've said so far? So, in essence, what Jesus is telling James and John, this is what he says is the lot for all disciples. You remember the teaching that Jesus followed up Peter's rebuke of him with? You won't suffer, Jesus. You're going to be okay. Remember what Jesus followed that up with? Mark chapter 8, verse 34. Then Jesus called the crowd to him along with his disciples and said, whoever wants to be my disciple must deny themselves and take up their cross and follow me. Whoever wants to save their life will lose it, but whoever loses their life for me and for the gospel will save it. What good is it for someone to gain the whole world and forfeit their soul? Or what can anyone give in exchange for their soul? If anyone is ashamed of me and my words in this adulterous and sinful generation, the Son of Man will be ashamed of them when he comes in his Father's glory with the holy angels. So first suffering, then glory. Every disciple has to take up their cross, James and John included. And so, as Jesus said, back to verse 40 of Mark chapter 10, but to sit at my right, you will be baptized with my baptism and drink my cup, but to sit at my right or my left is not for me to grant. It's not for me to grant merely upon request, but rather those places belong for those for whom they've been prepared. Those places belong for those who are willing to suffer for the kingdom, like I've suffered for the kingdom. And then Jesus will explain that more, in verses 41 to 44, or 45, which we'll look at next time, Lord willing.